Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for clicking on the video. It's the long Easter weekend. The sun is shining and we are headed into a place called Knoydart for 2 nights. Now, Knoydart is a remote peninsula on the west coast of Scotland. It's about an hour west of where I live in a small village called Fort Augustus. Knoydart makes up part of an area called the Rough Bounds, and it's also often referred to as Scotland's last wilderness. And the main reason for that is there's no roads into Knoydart, there's no phone signal in Knoydart, and the little settlement here is not even connected to the national grid. In terms of the environment, it's definitely not wilderness, far from it. The name Knoydart is thought to come from Norse, and it basically translates as Canute's Bay, as in King Canute, the Viking king. But yeah, there's only really 2 ways to get into Knoydart. One is to walk in from a place called Loch Earn on the east side of the peninsula, which is what I'm doing at the moment. The only other access really is by boat from the west side, from a place called Mallig, over to Inveree, which is the main settlement on Knoydart Peninsula itself. And the plan for this trip is we're walking into an area called Barrisdale Bay. It's a lovely big sandy bay. It's about 12 kilometres to hike in. We're going to spend a couple nights there, but tomorrow I'm hoping to go and explore an ancient Caledonian pinewood remnant in Glen Barrisdale. It's something I've been meaning to do for a long time. So yeah, we're just going to keep making our way along this kind of rough, rocky and very wet coastal path into Barrisdale. And if any of that interests you, stick around and I hope you enjoy the video. There's been a long history of people living in Knoydart for centuries, and there was even still 1,000 people living on the peninsula up until the mid 1800s before the Highland clearances. And it's actually a very typical landscape, typical of the Highlands, but this landscape has been heavily influenced by man. High numbers of sheep, high numbers of deer, high grazing pressure. There's, you know, behind me there, that's a big clump of Sitka spruce and larch as well by the looks of it. So 2 non-native species. So there's non-native trees here, you know, there's non-native forestry in other parts of the peninsula. So yeah, wilderness it is not. This is quite a steep little snap. I really need to start getting my hill fitness back. Whew. Not a bad view though. we're just starting to see the first kind of small ancient pinewood fragments that are left in Knoydart. There's a handful of very sparse scattered trees, but there's two kind of smaller groups in front of me here that I can see. Yeah, you can see that the areas that these trees are on are sort of the steepest, rockiest ground that was either too difficult for humans to clear or out of reach for sort of sheep and deer, and they've managed to survive by pure luck, really. Even if there was a fire, you'll often find remnant trees in a gorge, and you know, as the fire burns through, it almost skips over the gorge, so anything, you know, down in the gorge escapes the fire. So yeah, we'll keep going and we'll see if we can get a closer look at some of these. A lot of people say Scotland is the most beautiful place on earth, and I just can't get on board with that message. Not when you start to understand what's happened here. That's like going to the Amazon rainforest and it's all been cleared and you're still standing there going, this is the most beautiful place on earth. Now that might sound extreme, but we're not really that far off with what's happened here. And you know, imagine you came out to somewhere like Knoydart, remote peninsula, and it was just covered in this wild, natural pinewood. Then these places really would be, you know, able to rival anywhere in the world easily. But just knowing what's missing, I really struggle with it. Another problem with having high numbers of sheep and deer on the land eating everything is a lot of the flora and vegetation just can't cope with the repeated browsing. So you end up getting huge areas, which we have in Scotland, of this rough grass, deer grass and heather, which, you know, they can cope with the browsing. But the problem with that is that this grass dies off in the winter. Then you get to this time of year and you get a bit of sun and an easterly wind, it dries out, it's absolutely bone dry. And one little spark and this goes up, and then it catches the heather, and heather burns very well too, and you end up getting large wildfires, hill fires. And because we've got such big expanses of nothing, you know, these fires can rumble on for hectares and hectares and miles. So at this time of year, this is our biggest fire risk now. So if you're thinking about having fires or even camping stoves at this time of year, please just be extra careful. So you can see that Darach has his backpack on. There's not a lot in it, just his food, a bowl, and also his sort of walking harness. It's only about half a kilo of food, so he's not carrying much weight, but it just takes a bit of bulk out of my own bag, especially for 2 days. I think this is the estate house just here, with all the trees around it. I can see other sheds and buildings in the distance. Yeah, there's just a big grassy area for the campsite somewhere. A sign back there said about 700 metres, so a little bit to go yet. Well, here's the campsite. It's actually a bit bigger than I thought. Right, that's us all set up. Darach's inside just now. He's looking very tired. We've got a pretty good spot in the end where there's a watercourse just behind me. We're kind of furthest away from the buildings and behind a couple of trees as well, so screened a little bit. But yeah, it's pretty ideal. I'm going to go find out what the deal with the campsite is, because I think you're supposed to make a donation, especially if you're going to use the facilities. You know, like there's water and toilets, sort of in the bothy and the accommodation there. So I'll go and see what's what. I've got some cash with me just in case. Right, so I just went and checked out the bothy. The bothy is open. You can stay in it. It's got running water and a flushing toilet. The estate office is on the side of the building, and there's one guy here. I'm guessing it's like the ranger or the keeper. It's £5 per person per night for the tent and the bothy. and there's an honesty box, but you can also pay by card in the estate office, so there's no excuse really. Right, I'm going to make my dinner now. A few years ago I bought a cheap dehydrator and a vacuum packer from Lidl or something like that. I've never really used it, but the price of these camp meals is getting ridiculous, so I've had to go out making my own. I didn't really need to vacuum pack it for this trip because I only made it a few days ago, but I was just really trying it out, but it worked pretty well, so I think I'm going to make more meals myself this year for trips like this. Some of the meals, you know, even just for a 600 calorie one, they're like 9, 10, 11 pounds. It's just ridiculous. So I'm basically going to boil up some water, stick this in, and then just leave it for 10 minutes and let it rehydrate. We've got it's basically like a pasta bolognese type thing, but with actual pasta instead of spaghetti. Got some dried olives, mushrooms in here. I mean, there's probably well over 1,000 calories in this meal. So yeah, quite looking forward to this. So I'll put this on now and boil some water. Pretty good. You can really taste the olives as well, that's really nice. Just been chilling out this evening. It's past 9 now. Kind of darkness crept up on us quite quickly there. I was just reading my book, but yeah, hoping for a good night's sleep, and I will see you all in the morning. Good morning, folks. Had a really good night's sleep. I must have fell asleep by maybe 10:30. It's 8:30 now. I just woke up a while ago. Kind of half woke up a couple times through the night. It got a little bit gusty with the wind, but yeah, just a really comfortable sleeping position and comfortable temperature. So yeah, I slept really well. So just about to set off, and this stag that's been wandering about pulling all the food out from these people's tents, and it was chewing on the plastic bag and other bits and pieces. I've tried to put as much back in as possible, but it's not fussed at all. I would have swallowed the whole plastic bag if I could. Go on, go on. Like as soon as I leave, it's going to go and try and pull the food out as well, but there's not really much I can do. Hopefully you can hear me over the wind, but that kind of highlights a very important issue in our landscape, is that these deer are at such a high density and there's so little food for them, they're basically starving. And especially at this time of year, before things, you know, they've kind of made it through the winter, just things aren't really growing yet, you know, there's nothing succulent again yet, and they're really struggling. And you know, in a normal ecosystem, something like a wolf would have picked the weak ones off, the weak and the old ones, during the winter, and the stronger ones would survive. They also get moved on, so areas of vegetation get a chance to recover again, and everything's in balance. But in terms of deer in this country, everything's so out of balance. You get deer wandering down to a campsite trying to eat a plastic bag because it's got traces of food on it. It's sad, to be honest. And if that deer eats that plastic bag, then they're going to have all sorts of intestinal problems as well. It might die an agonising death, to be honest. So when people romanticise the deer hanging about the car park in places like Glen, you know, they maybe want to think about that a little bit more. Right, so here we are at the Barrisdale ancient Caledonian pinewood remnant, or what's left of it. As you've seen throughout the video so far, there are tiny fragments all along Loch Hearn where we started, into Barrisdale itself, but this is one of the main kind of core remnants that's left. And although it's a shadow of its former self, I'm a little surprised. There are other species in here. There's a bit of rowan, there's some old birch, quite a bit of juniper as well, big juniper, which you don't often see. These species normally just get wiped out much earlier than the pine, so that's a little positive. And so far, I don't think I've actually explained where the term Caledonian comes from and what exactly it means. And there are quite a few theories wrapped up in some of this. If you do a Google search, you'll get different views and different opinions, but essentially Caledonia was thought to be the name that the Romans used to refer to the sort of northern part of Scotland, everything north of the Firth of Forth, which is near to Edinburgh, which is essentially the Highlands. And in the north, there was this vast, impenetrable forest called the Great Wood of Caledon, or that's what the Romans wanted people to think, as part of the reason why they weren't able to conquer the north of Scotland, basically. Now, how widespread this forest actually was is still disputed, and it's commonly romanticised as this kind of never-ending, dense, pine forests, you know, right across the whole Highlands. But in reality, it was probably quite a mixed landscape with areas of dense pine forest, but also lots of more open woodland made up of birch, rowan, aspen, oak, juniper, these kind of things. And obviously you would have had peat bogs and sort of bog woodland, and it was kind of a matrix of all these things, not just, you know, wall to wall dense pine, almost like a plantation. And you would have had a lot more montane scrub as well, the sort of high altitude, gnarled, small kind of willows and dwarf birch and this kind of thing. And that habitat's almost completely missing from Scotland and the Highlands today. So it would have looked quite different, you know, to what we see these days. These ancient pinewood remnants, which have survived for the last 350 years and are sort of directly descended from the original forest through natural means, are now referred to as ancient Caledonian pinewood, and the individual trees themselves as Caledonian pines. And this helps to sort of keep them separated from other pinewoods that exist today that have maybe been planted or created by humans, you know, somehow, or, you know, they're kind of newer, or they're in areas that there wouldn't necessarily be natural pinewood like this. But as I've mentioned before, these Caledonian pines as a species are Pinus sylvestris, or Scots pine as they're commonly known, but Scots pine has many common names. It's also referred to as Baltic pine, Scotch pine if you're in the US, and it also used to be called Scots fir in the past. But it's definitely not a fir, it's a pine. It's even sometimes referred to as European redwood because of the colour of its timber. If you see pine trees, got that very kind of orange red wood. But Scots pine as a species has a huge range. It basically stretches from Scotland here in the west all the way across to eastern Siberia, and then it's obviously very common in the north of Scandinavia, but you can get Scots pine right the way down to central Spain as well. So, you know, huge area to cover. But in terms of the UK and Scotland, Scots pine's sort of natural range very much is restricted to the Highlands, and the natural pine forests here are considered, you know, an extreme western outpost of the bigger, you know, boreal forest, and it's actually classified as quite a unique habitat in its own right, compared to a lot of the pine forests across its sort of northern range. And Scots pine usually prefers acidic, sort of dry soils which are low in nutrients. However, the pine here have evolved to be able to survive in the very wet and windy climate we have here in the north of Scotland. And we can break that down even further because the species characteristics just in the Highland region are different from west to east. In the east, where the climate and the soils are a bit more like say Scandinavia, you can get quite dense natural pine forests, you know, growing quite straight. But in the west, the pine forests are a lot more open, and that's when you see these kind of big gnarled trees with the, you know, the big open wide crowns. And there's a much bigger broadleaf component in these woodlands in the West Highlands, you know, with oak, downy birch, rowan, aspen, these kind of species. And those western pinewoods actually form a very important component of the Atlantic rainforest, which covers the western fringe of Scotland and the UK, which is a very unique habitat in itself, and is also severely under threat and in a very fragile state. And some of the most western pinewoods we have in Scotland, like the one at Shieldig near to Applecross, and the pine forest at Lochmarie near Kinlochhew, they are actually even more genetically unique because they are thought to be descended from a sort of remnant population either in Ireland or a stretch of land out to the west, you know, off the coast that's now underwater, and they've been found, compared to Scots pine in other areas of the country, you know, there's genetic markers there to show that they're quite different and, you know, unique again. But the pine in places like this and the West Highland really is at the extreme edge of its growing limit here, which makes it incredibly fragile, and if we lose them, it's very hard to bring them back, especially with all the landscape changes and land management we now impose in these places. Yeah, so this ancient Caledonian pinewood remnant at Glen Barrisdale has been pretty lucky to hold on, and it's definitely one of the more remote and inaccessible remnants we have. But yeah, as I've explained there, it makes up part of one of the most unique woodland environments in the whole of Northern Europe, and also part of the critically endangered Atlantic rainforest habitat. So it really isn't just another pinewood, you know, these remnants are incredibly important. We are just making our way back. We sat beside the river for about an hour and a half there. It's just really nice and warm in the sun, and we don't really have anywhere to be, so why not? I'm just walking back the way we came out. So we're back at the tent. There's a few people at the campsite, maybe 4 or 5 tents, but it's feeling very warm now. It must be, I don't know, 14, 15 degrees. Yeah, I'm not really going to do much, to be honest, just chill out, probably read my book a little bit. I'll make dinner in a while. Oh, I just saw a swallow. First swallow of the year. Yeah, we're getting surrounded by sheep at the moment, although Darach's too tired to even register them. Well, that's it, just coming up to 7 o'clock, so I'm going to make some dinner. Getting a bit hungry now. It's just the same as last night. I just made 2 portions. And to be honest, that's about it for this evening. I think I'm just going to eat and relax, just keep reading my book. The wind's sort of picking up again, and it's clouded over quite a bit, so I don't think it's going to be as clear as last night. Right folks, that is just coming up 10 o'clock. Pretty tired now. Like I said, just been reading my book all evening, had dinner, nice and relaxed. Hoping to get up early tomorrow morning, get packed up, hopefully walking out of here about 8 o'clock would be good. But yeah, I think I'll call it a day there, and I will see you in the morning. I'm pretty much all packed up, apart from the tent obviously, and a bit of cooking equipment, just making coffee and porridge. But I can smell someone cooking bacon over there, and it just makes this porridge seem so depressing. Some bacon would be good. But I'm probably going to leave it there, to be honest. Like I say, I'll just get packed up, and I'm just walking out the exact same way, so I'm probably not going to film much unless I see something significant. But it's been another good trip. I've been planning to get in and see these pinewood remnants in Knoydart for some time, so it's good to finally do it. It would be quite good to come back a bit later in the year, when all the leaves are out as well, just to see the full extent of the woodland here. But it's still been good. It's been nice temperature. There's no midge yet. It's been relatively quiet in terms of people, so that's part of the reason I came sort of earlier in the season rather than later. But yeah, thanks again for watching. Please stick around for Forest Thoughts if you want to. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about Knoydart and what's happening here. But if you don't, I will see you on the next one. Hi folks, thanks again for sticking around for Forest Thoughts. Now I know I've done a lot of talking in this video, so credit to you if you stuck it out and you're still here. I'll try and rattle through this as quickly as possible. But at the start of the video I mentioned that the Knoydart Peninsula is often referred to as Scotland's last wilderness, but as you've hopefully seen through this video, it definitely is not wilderness, and humans have had a heavy influence on the land here, as is common across much of the Highlands. Now from the 1700s onwards, Knoydart had a fairly typical history, similar to much of the Highlands, and up until the mid 1800s there were 1,000 people living here, mainly crofting and fishing. And if you don't know what crofting is, to put it very simply, it's a system, a traditional system of small scale farming, low impact farming that was widespread across the Highlands. And shortly after this time there was a period of eviction and emigration, and this was due to the Highland clearances. And again, in a very simplified explanation, because it is a complex and sensitive subject, this was basically a process of removing people who lived and worked on the land, carried out by the government, and that land was then sold off to the highest bidder. And a lot of these new landlords forcibly removed people from the land and replaced them with large-scale sheep farming, essentially. Moving on to Victorian times, and Knoydart was managed as a traditional sporting estate, so as well as the sheep eating everything in sight, the deer populations were then kept unnaturally high for sport shooting, which obviously put even more pressure on any existing natural vegetation or woodland clinging on, but as I said before, that's nothing special. You know, it happened across the majority of the Highlands, and you can see the evidence, you know, pretty much anywhere you look in the Highlands. But there are also areas of forestry in Knoydart here where people have planted timber crops of sort of non-native species in the past. You know, there's a couple of small blocks here near to where I'm camping. There's buildings scattered around the peninsula, including here at Barrisdale, which you've seen, and over at the the main settlement on the west side at Inveree. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's definitely not untouched wilderness here, and I think it's important that there's wider recognition from people in general when spending time in these places of that, because that detail and perspective, I feel, is very important. But from the 1,000 plus people that lived here in the mid 1800s, there's now just over 100 people living on Knoydart. But in 1997, the Knoydart Foundation, which is a charity, was formed, and in 1999 they were actually successful in one of the very first community land buyouts of the Knoydart estate, which covers the majority of the peninsula. So Knoydart has kind of come full circle, and the land is now owned and managed by the local community once again. And the foundation has loads going on. They have a community-owned hydro scheme to provide power to the locals. They are providing affordable accommodation, local employment. They've got a community shop, and they've got accommodation on offer for visitors as well. But the most important part of this is the land here is now being managed for the benefit of people and the environment. The Knoydart Forest Trust was also created to manage the woodland across the estate, and this involves managing the sort of community-owned plantations by Inveree, which includes kind of felling non-native trees and replanting with native species. They're using that timber for local building projects, firewood supply, even like local crafts and things like that as well. But they're also managing the native woodland remnants on the Knoydart estate, and this kind of involves fencing, controlling the deer, bringing the deer numbers down so trees can get away. They're even doing small scale planting in some areas, and the long-term aim is to try and connect up some of these sort of smaller fragile remnants and make it a more robust woodland. But elsewhere on Knoydart, the John Muir Trust actually own 1,200 hectares, and they are also protecting and expanding any native woodland on their ground, which is positive as well. There's still a few private estates scattered across the peninsula, carrying out more traditional management like you've seen here with sheep and deer. But I think the difference now is it's not across the whole area. It's a lot more smaller scale. There's more land being managed for people in the environment now than for traditional management in this area. And I think as well, with the foundation at the core of things, there's a lot more joined up thinking and working together at scale, especially when it comes to deer populations in Knoydart, which that's the kind of thing that makes the big difference. People working in isolation only works to a certain point. And I think that mix of land use is more sustainable as well. As long as it's in balance, we can have a bit of everything if we're clever about it. Again, I could talk about this all day, but I won't. And as always, I'll put the links in the description to everything I've talked about today, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look if you're if you're interested and want to know more. I really appreciate you sticking around this long and listening to me talk so much. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will hopefully see you on the next one.